Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of How Do I Social Science? I know it's kind of been a while, and that's partially because whenever I put up a poll on the Twitter about my next video topic, probably unsurprisingly, the pure social science lessons tend to lose out over current event topics and things that are sort of more relevant to whatever's going on in the world, and maybe that's why perhaps I should stop asking about it. Anyway, today's video, we'll cover a topic that's a bit more foreign to me than the first three did, which all focused either on general concepts about statistics or quantitative methodology, as today we will be covering qualitative research methods. As some of you may know, I consider myself to be a quantitative empirical post-positivist, meaning that I tend to look at data and information from the lens of that which is quantifiable, that is measurable, empirical, that is observable, and from the perspective of post-positivism, which requires falsifiability. However, there are benefits and uses to qualitative methods that provide perspectives from outside that from which I tend to view, or at least prefer to view, scientific data. As such, today I think it's very important that we get into sort of the more touchy-feely sort of side of social science, into qualitative research methods. There's a number of reasons for this, but most of all it's because I think that it's highly misunderstood. There tends to be some sort of perception that qualitative research methods are poo-poo or doo-doo, and we shouldn't use them because it's stupid feminist bullshit. That's not really correct. There are actual real uses for qualitative research methods. They can be extremely useful and advantageous for quantitative research methods as well. Thus, let's get into what is qualitative research methods. How do we utilize qualitative research methods? What kind of information do they help provide to the wealth of human knowledge? So, of course, the first question is, what is qualitative research? Well, qualitative research gives us additional information that we simply are not able to assess through quantitative methods. Again, quantitative methods only refer mostly to counting. Quantitative being, what is the quantity, in its most simplistic form. For example, though, when all qualitative data is nominal, that is a simple yes or no answer to a question, or even more detailed in ordinal, interval, or ratio level data, as we would find from more Likert-type instrumentation data collected from quantitative research methods. Quantitative data generally are restrictive in that they require participants to select a single answer, even when that one single answer may not really accurately represent the complexities of the participants' feelings towards the question or prompt. Surely most of you have felt this way. When
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Taking a multiple choice test, you thought, well, I guess I'll select this one. That seems to represent me most accurately, but it doesn't really speak to me. That is the purpose of qualitative data, of open-ended responses, because the close-ended responses, the Likert-type instrumentation, the multiple choice question, did not really assess the true complexities of your feelings towards the question. Again, this is the use of qualitative research, by allowing for open-ended responses, researcher interpretation, and researcher interaction with participants in order to further understand the nuances of responses in greater depth. This doesn't mean that all qualitative data is just feels rather than reals. In fact, often analysis of qualitative data can be transformed from these more nuanced information, these open-ended responses, into numerical values so that then they can be analyzed statistically. For example, in the case of the prevalence of a theme across various responses. We can count how many times a theme shows up, and then run it through a statistical analysis. There are also various forms of qualitative analysis, some of which we will discuss in greater depth, including observation, interviews, focus groups, narrative analysis, thematic analysis, and ethnography, among others. But the main thing to keep in mind when we consider qualitative research is that it is a process that has an inherent quality of subjectivity, and that's just an accepted aspect of qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, which seeks to mitigate or ameliorate all non-objective elements. In qualitative research, we not only anticipate, but we expect subjective responses and subjectivity in general towards the research. There's a number of reasons for this, but they are in no way bad, right? This is actually something that we want because it allows us to get into the nitty-gritty of the details, things that we, again, can't just find out through mere cold, hard data. Subjectivity in this context, though, is how an individual or a group constructs the perception of reality of events, needing be described by the individual and not being capable of being directly measured in the way we would seek to do so in an objective quantitative methodology. In quantitative methods, the researcher is intended to be a neutral third-party observer, uninvolved with data collection process as much as possible, and utilizing methods that avoid any contamination of the data from their personal bias or subjective perceptions.
What I find fantastic is any notion that there are answers beyond the realm of science. The answers are there. You just have to know where to look.
That's why they put the I in FBI.
In contrast, in qualitative methods, there is an actual expectation of integration of the researcher with the data being assessed on some level. This is because of the purpose of qualitative research being not so much to isolate causal or even correlational links between variables, but rather to understand in more detail the why, rather than the mere what of social science questions. Basically, when we look at quantitative data, we're just looking at counting, we're looking at being able to put things into a graph and see how frequent they are, how different variables are related to one another. But when we look at qualitative data, we're instead trying to understand the nuances and the subtleties of an individual variable, of an individual question. What's actually going on here, and why is it going on? Often qualitative research is looking at many variables at once to see how many elements may play a role in the complex analysis of a topic as well. Because qualitative methods not only allow but anticipate participation from the researcher on some level, to get, down in the dirt with the data such as it is, this also allows for a more naturalistic approach to understanding any said topic, to really see what's going on from the ground level, rather than from an elevated, sort of removed and sterile position of quantitative research analysis that we would typically see. It is important to note, however, that despite this description, quantitative and qualitative methods are not dichotomistically opposed, and in fact work together most fruitfully, with quantitative data providing the raw numbers and qualitative data providing an explanation for said numbers. This is what we call mixed methods, and is really the most holistic way of examining any particular subject or topic. So, how do qualitative researchers collect data and interact with their subjects, since we know that there is an aspect of subjectivity, and we know that it means that qualitative researchers will be involved with their subjects? Typically, researchers need to envelop themselves, qualitative researchers that is, into a topic from reading, interacting with subjects, developing an ongoing and evolving theory as new data and information present themselves, and is assessed in order to sort of be part of this constantly moving and developing sense of responses. Often, things will be very open to interpretation until near the completion of the analysis, as the researcher attempts to gain better understanding of the context and subtleties of participants' responses and behaviors over time. In other words, things are kind of up to interpretation, again, as the process moves forward. There are benefits and detriments to this. The benefits, of course, being that it means things can change, that you could be proven wrong and you can easily change your sort of perspective or theoretical outlook on a topic as things evolve. However, in contrast, of course, it means that you could be working on something for months only to find out that your initial theoretical framework was complete and utter bunk.
I turned to science because I thought it would be different than music, but it isn't. It's just the same. It's just as much of an art as anything else. You're an artist, Major. Maybe the best I've ever seen. I'm just critical because I'm jealous.
I'm touched, really. Wish I had a brilliant plan to draw for you.
And you're funny, too. Even electrocuted. Me, I got nothing.
Another potential benefit, though, of qualitative research and personal involvement with it is that it allows a researcher's personal experiences and observations, as well as his or her unique background or experience in a field of inquiry, to help frame his or her understanding. Now, hang on, I said that's a benefit, and a lot of you may be thinking, whoa, Aiden, what the fuck? Someone's personal biases can help them? Well, yeah, it kind of can, at least in this instance. If this person has a lot of understanding, a lot of experience working with a group of people, well, yes, of course, their personal experiences actually will help them in forming a greater understanding of a unique or nuanced group of people that are attempting to study. Of course, again, as I mentioned, quantitative scholars would find that bias and skew to be a great detriment, but in the subjective lens of qualitative work, the goals of research are different, and thus, unique experiences may allow the researcher greater ability to understand the nuances and idiosyncrasies of his or her selected group or subject.
I'm not teaching any philosophy. What I'm trying to teach is pure science.
Some might say pure science, taught without a spiritual context, is a philosophy, Mrs. O'Brien.
My philosophy is that there is room for all philosophies on this station. Now, How do you suggest that we deal with this?
I'm not sure you can.
The main purpose of qualitative analysis, again, is to get into these complexities of answers to social science questions that just simply cannot be answered on a simple or typical Likert-type instrument or series of yes or no questions. Again, as I mentioned above, it's still possible to locate, for instance, numerical values within qualitative analysis, such as the number of times a participant mentioned a certain word or phrase, and utilize these frequency to transform these more dense narratives into statistically accessible and analyzable data, but that's not really what the purpose is again. Through a process called triangulation, though, social scientists can use multiple methods of data collection, analysis, and assessment, including various types of both quantitative and qualitative assessment, in order to best answer social science questions. Hence, once again, illustrating the use and value of qualitative methodology. Unlike quantitative methods, qualitative research is usually not looking to answer a directed hypothesis. And I believe our last video we talked about what is a hypothesis and how does it work. Although there are instances in which research coming from a qualitative standpoint may have a hypothesis, generally speaking, that's not the case. Instead, most qualitative research methods seek to answer more open-ended research questions. Research questions, not hypotheses. Unlike a hypothesis, a research question, or RQ, suggests not only no directional relationship between variables, but really suggests no relationship inherent, instead asking merely if a relationship exists at all, merely to describe said relationship, not to find out how X is related to Y, but to describe X. Does X even exist? What this all means is that research questions are simply seeking to gain a greater understanding of a general topic, either because little information currently exists, or because the topic may be too broad to make any kind of direct predictions about it, or because it's just something that we don't know much about, and we want to just gain a greater understanding of it. Much as qualitative research can help provide context to excellent information we have collected from quantitative resource sources to answer questions about the why, in this sense, qualitative research can also serve as the foundation for further quantitative research, given that it lays the groundwork by providing some preliminary answers to questions regarding an area of inquiry. In other words, if there's something we know fucking nothing about, we can engage in some qualitative research methodology that asks very open-ended research questions, and then based on the findings that we observe and that we see from the results of our inquiry, then from that point we can make directed hypotheses from a quantitative standpoint. When we're entering a totally new field of study, we often just lack any relevant theoretical frameworks. For this purpose, then yes, as I said, for the purpose of clarification of more ambiguous topics, research and research questions have a very useful place in research. There are several different instances for which a researcher might pose a research question, though, other than the ones that I sort of touched on briefly above, rather than a hypothesis, including specific interactions or unique events, to further understand specific interactions or events, in instances where experimentation is unethical or impossible, such as, for example, in the social sciences, in the case of understanding the psychology of rape victims, or in biology, doing a genetic knockout study on nigger dick size.
No, we have fucking not. We have not done a knockout study on nigger dick size.
Assessing new or unknown phenomena that may lack the appropriate framework for analysis, as I mentioned. Long-term processing of subjects or topics that are not so easily assessed by statistical longitudinal analysis through multiple choice or questionnaire answers, or finally, to further understand particular concepts or topics of interest for more in-depth analysis of the why of a topic, once again, rather than the mere numerical output of the what. In terms of the methods themselves, there are various collection techniques found within qualitative work that we wouldn't find within quantitative methods. Most simply, you have open-ended questions. These are often included in a battery of multiple-choice questions in a questionnaire that a researcher may be using to assess with a statistical analysis for quantitative research purposes. These open-ended questions allow participants to explain their answers, and when assessed, can again answer the questions of the why of the research. Well, yes, I see that you answered the question yes, but why did you answer the question yes? Basically, how does this make you feel?
What does this color make you think of? A warm summer's day? The light of a sun? A smiling child? What does it make you think of now? Maybe the way the sunbeams are bouncing off of a still river. Maybe it's making you think of the surface of a sunflower. How does this make you feel now? I can't say it. I can't say it. I seriously am trying so hard. Okay. What? How do you feel now?
Qualitative researchers can also collect information in the form of one-on-one interviews with participants. While researchers will have a specific list of questions to ask, and it should be very highly structured, this process does allow for elaboration and clarification from the interviewee that is really not an option in the form of a self-answered questionnaire. Again, in a questionnaire, the participant is just basically anticipated to have the wherewithal to understand what the question is, and to answer it completely. Now, in an interview, if the participant does not answer the question succinctly or wholly, the interviewer can say, "Could you please be more specific?" Or can try to get at what the participant is really saying in order to understand his or her answer more thoroughly. Interviews can also be recorded with audio or video, or simply just made note of on the part of the interviewee, the researcher. But there are reasons to use video and audio recording, because, of course, video and audio content can be further analyzed after the fact to allow the researcher to pay greater attention to, say, the body language or patterns of speech of the participant. Because when we're talking about communication, and that is what we're talking about here, social science data, there can be a lot that is not said. Sometimes, in fact, there can be more that is not said than that is said in the answer to a question. Additionally, qualitative data can be collected from focus groups. That is essentially an interview conducted between an interviewee, a researcher, and a small number of participants in a roundtable discussion, who answer questions collaboratively or often in response to one another. This approach allows for conversations to evolve naturally, and for new ideas or concepts to be introduced by others into the group conversation that may spark responses from any individual member of the group that may otherwise not ever be incurred or brought up in a one-on-one environment between the researcher and the interviewee. Of course, any social format increases the potentiality for social desirability bias. That is, people may answer questions in the way they think is most pro-social or normal, yet that answer does not really reflect their true or real opinions, but rather ones that they think they're expected to say, out of fear of shame or ostracization. Similarly, as soon as communication moves to group from interpersonal, you have additional potentiality for group effects, such as consensus or groupthink, which we have identified since the famous Asch experiment in 1951. That in and of itself initially found the incredible ability of groups to come to false conclusions and even agree to absolute falsehoods, when others within the group supported said conclusions. Thus, while we know that subjectivity bias is inherent in all qualitative data analysis, focus groups provide additional challenges to the validity of the data, given the potentiality for group effects and behavior. Still, there are benefits to focus groups, and a good interviewer should be able to keep the group on track without allowing it to spiral into chaos. Unlike quantitative research, which requires random sampling in order to avoid error, given that there is an inherent subjective nature to qualitative research, it is therefore, once again, no surprise that qualitative sampling also uses more subjective methods of finding participants. Often, qualitative researchers are looking not to understand the populace at large, as we would be doing in quantitative research methods, and, how that whole populace is disparate in its little tiny idiosyncrasies through the use of a true random sample. But rather, qualitative is often more interested in understanding a specific group and its function and its idiosyncrasies in more detail. Thus, much purely qualitative research does not utilize random sampling, but rather targeted sampling methods, including snowball sampling, for example, which request participants contact others that they know who would be eligible for the study in order to reach a greater desired unique population, and also potentially instill a sense of trust in the researcher, given that the information about the study was distributed from a known acquaintance, a friend, or a family member. In other words, hey, do you want to be part of this study? They're gonna pay you $50. Also, I met with the researcher and he or she is a pretty cool person. Yeah, particularly when you're looking at getting to know participants, wanting them to actually tell you the truth, sometimes tell you very intimate details about their lives, snowball sampling can be quite useful. Similarly, though, there's network sampling, which utilizes existing networks to gather as many participants of a particular group as possible, but both of these are examples of what's called purposive sampling. Purposive sampling, pretty simply, seeks not random members of the population in order to represent the population as a whole, but specific members of a targeted group. The rationale for random sampling is that a non-random sample will not represent the total populace, and therefore any data forwarded from a non-random sample is not generalizable to the population as a whole. In a story I believe I've told before, I mentioned that one of my alma maters had a famous run-in with the problem of random sampling when a Playboy journalist showed up the day after the cessation of spring break in the 1970s on the arts and humanities side of campus and asked a bunch of philosophy majors how big of a party school the place was. And in turn, the philosophy majors, hungover and still maybe outright drunk out of their fucking minds, responded,
"Yes, there absolutely will be a margarita in my mouth. Spring break! Woo!"
and proceeded to pass out in a drunken stupor in front of the journalist, thus landing said school in the top 10 party school list for decades to follow. That is a problem of random sampling, because the journalist did not go over to the engineering campus, or the medical campus, just the arts and humanities one, and again, during a sort of off period of time. But again, qualitative researchers aren't interested in making large sweeping generalizations about a large populace, but rather about understanding specific populations or even very specific contexts in greater detail. This is why qualitative research relies in part on researcher interpretation and subjective valuing of information gathered. In order to increase the total accuracy of qualitative research and its scope to incorporate as much of a target population as possible, however, researchers can utilize maximum variation in data collection, which essentially involves the use of purposive sampling continually, over time, in order to gather and assess as much data as possible to paint the most complete picture as possible of the analyzed or assessed group, context, or environ, until the point to which any additional data would become redundant. Regardless of whether or not maximum variation can be collected, once researchers have a sufficient sample, they must of course analyze the data, both in quantitative and in qualitative. But in qualitative, how do we assess and analyze the data? We've been over this a little bit in quantitative, so let's look at the other side. There are many types of qualitative analysis, and I'm only going to cover a couple of very general ones here because this is a very general overview of qualitative analysis before you fucking come into my comments section and start talking about qualitative comparative analysis, Dr. Lehman. You can explain how QCA is as close to qualitative research can come to experimentation and establishment of causal linkage that qualitative analysis is capable of. I'm not really going to do it here, because I would barely consider it even a pure qualitative research tool, and rather more of a mixed methods tool. Anyway, everyone, there are multiple methods, again, of analyses that are used in qualitative research that are really not utilized in quantitative research. In general, most qualitative analysis methods are a combination of analysis and researcher interpretation of the data as a result of any subjective elements we've talked about above. Oftentimes, this involves the coding of information, that is, the transformation of a narrative, descriptive, or complex data into numerical values on some level, typically, let's say, through occurrences, by noting how many times a certain theme, a word, a phrase shows up within the extended response, be it written, interview, or focus group oriented from participants. We can actually do this with computer programs fairly easily at this point. by simply having a computer look for the number of times a certain phrase or word appeared across a participant's answers to an open-ended question, for instance. However, often mere words alone do not create an accurate categorization of a topic, theme, or subject. Categorization within text involves labeling, definition of terms, recognition of the differences or similarities of a term or terms, exclusion of some information or terms as not part of the category or as completely erroneous to the category, and can be typified by examples of said category. This is how you take something that you are looking for in a, let's say, narrative that someone has provided you in their open-ended response, and look for specific categories. First, you gotta define what the category is. Once a categorical theme, though, has been established, again, we can run it through a computer and try to pick up not just the instances of a word, but instances of a theme. However, there may be some use, and in fact there is probably great use, in multiple human coders with their wider and more varied potential for interpretation of the categories being sought out or assessed than what we might get by just running it through a computer, which is going to oftentimes make mistakes. Not because computers make mistakes so much, but because computers don't have the same ability to pick up on nuance or slight details in the writing. And it's not just in the writing itself or in the context in which words are being spoke, but it can be in how words are underlined in an extended response or the body language utilized by a participant if we're talking about an interview, for example. These are the reasons why you might want a person, a real person, to get in there and code your information, to look for your categories, to isolate them rather than a computer. But you might ask, well, how do we figure out what these categories were in the first place, and what they mean, or what they're supposed to mean, I suppose? And oftentimes, that's going to be through something called grounded theory. Grounded theory is, according to Lindlof and Taylor, 2002, grounded in relationships between data and the categories into which they are coded, and codes and categories are immutable until late in the project. See page 218. Grounded theory is a kind of rough approach, I would say, that attempts to take these categories, these definitions, labels, etc., and determine how the information collected through qualitative research falls into them. How are these categories isolated? Well, usually, again, by open coding, which is a sort of best guess approach to understanding the data. That is, by taking a look at it, just taking a look down at the page, and seeing what pops off of it. Any relevant themes or, well, categories. That's open coding. What do I pretty much see in front of my fucking face? After this initial open coding, researchers typically engage in axial coding, which takes the initial first glance approach and refines it, generally into a codebook of observable tendencies and categories within the data set. The way to test whether the codebook and the isolated categories are more than just a coincidence or the ravings of the social scientist lunatic mind is in having multiple coders take a look at the data and see if they possess high intercoder reliability between their own assessments. That is, if all the coders found the same themes to appear in the responses at the same general frequency, then you know you have a good codebook. Meanwhile, if the responses are all over the place and different people looked at your data and your codebook and interpreted it in completely disparate ways, you probably want to revise your codebook. As stated above, though, it will likely be until late in the research process before all of the themes and categories are fully isolated, and thus the process is highly mutable as it proceeds forward. However, the ultimate goal of grounded theory is to take sort of an unstructured topic or area of research and provide a new theoretical structure for it through this arduous process of categorization. That is, after significant review, the categories can find boundary conditions and move from this highly volatile and mutable position into a more immutable position in their definition, such that conclusions about the entire dataset can be derived. Again, we are looking at answers about a specific group or context, but grounded theory allows us to provide a framework, and the purpose for that framework, what's really interesting about it, is that it can help inform and direct further quantitative data that may be collected in the future about a certain group or context. Additionally, qualitative researchers may choose to utilize thematic analysis. A theme is a conceptualization of an interaction, a relationship, or an event, and the thematic analysis looks at responses to open-ended questions, interviews or focus groups, etc., for evidence of emergent themes. Themes can appear through reoccurrence, which is the repetition of categories or concepts as we would find in sort of grounded theory approach to research, repetition, which is the precise reiteration of a certain phraseology, and forcefulness, which is the stress, be it physical, such as through the force placed upon a pen in answering a question through underlining, through capitalization of the answers to a question on a piece of paper, or through the decibel level of one's voice in an interview when discussing a certain topic or theme. Once themes are isolated, unlike grounded theory, which is often then utilized in moving into a more mixed methodological usage through statistical analysis, thematic analysis often uses more critical cultural stances to understand the meaning of data, such as metaphor, which assesses meaning through the lens of another context or environment, dramatic, which is the use of storytelling or plots to place meaning, or theoretical, which extends philosophical or scientific frameworks to understand meaning again. All of this can be utilized tangentially with quantitative data through triangulation, as I've explained earlier, thus providing useful information of both the what and the when, as well as the why and the how, of various social scientific questions. In general, however, what qualitative research really provides us with is the flavor, the spice of life, or at least the spice of research, such as it is a thing, rather than the pure hard facts. And yes, I am a little bit biased when I say that, being I am one who prefers hard data, I have a difficult time in and of myself wanting to utilize qualitative data sometimes, or at least going to it first, I should say. It is without question, though, that qualitative research examines in micro detail different information, groups, and contexts in order to provide a greater elucidation upon the macro at large. While it generally assesses a small number of participants in detail, those details can have not only implications for larger groups, more importantly, they can provide answers to otherwise unanswerable enigma, answers that we just can't access otherwise. Once again, qualitative analysis gives us the full intent of a participant's responses to an otherwise often restrictive set of questions. As I said in the beginning, I'm sure you've all taken plenty of Likert-type multiple-choice instrument tests in your lives, and you know how highly limiting they can be. Thus, qualitative data allow us to get into the nitty-gritty details of the data, to really understand how participants think and feel. What do you really think?
Anyway, I'm sorry, but that just happens to be how I feel about it. What do you think? It's just a question.
And while, yes, there are problems of social desirability, we can account for these and further look to body language engaged in while responding, which in and of itself can be enormously illuminating as to the reality of what a participant means or thinks. Ultimately, qualitative data provides an in-depth analysis that goes beyond mere limited checkbox self-report, and often provides new insight into statistical and experimental observations in the form of full, embodied responses from participants. And while biases are inherent to qualitative research, through the use of mixed methods, we can help mitigate and ameliorate the effects of these biases through the pairing with more stringent, or cold if you want to call it that, quantitative data with the more in-depth and emotive, if you want to call it that, qualitative data. In conclusion, let's go over some of the basics of what we learned about qualitative research. Qualitative research is sensitive and is utilized mostly to gain greater understanding of a phenomena through an approach that deviates from pure statistical data collection and analysis, by instead going in and looking at the why sort of questions. Can I get there down deep into that and understand how you really feel? It is subjective inherently and does not aim to eliminate bias. In fact, it accepts and embraces its own biases, unlike a quantitative approach. Generally, qualitative data seeks greater understanding, but cannot seek to determine causal relationships between variables. The best option we have is QCA, but even that does not anywhere near approach being capable of forming causal associations between variables from a qualitative standpoint. The in-depth nature of qualitative research requires a level of involvement of the researcher that is not only absent, but that is actively highly discouraged in quantitative research. This has ups and downs. It means that yes, the research is more biased, but it also means that the researcher can have insight that otherwise might be lacking from a detached observer from a quantitative standpoint. Given the open-ended nature of these inquiries, they are typified by research questions rather than hypotheses, as we mentioned. Finally, while qualitative data are not usually generalizable to the public at large, they do provide unique information that answer questions otherwise unanswerable from the sterile or purely mathematical standpoint of quantitative scientific analysis, as well as forwarding data about small groups or individual contexts that otherwise may not be assessed in detail in analysis of the total population, providing a more complete understanding of the world and our social contexts. And thus, despite the fact that I myself have an obvious bias towards more quantitative research methodology, I hope today I have explained some of the reasons for which qualitative research methods are not only important, but actually really necessary for the study of the human condition and human society in the various fields of the social sciences, be it social psychology to sociology to communication research. This isn't just stupid, absolute pointless bullshit. There actually are reasons for which people conduct qualitative research. They are essentially, quantitative and qualitative that is, two halves of the same coin that together form a very useful whole for the purpose of understanding human behavior in general, or at least greater understanding of human behavior in general. I know it is very easy to look at the ridiculous things that are published in academic journals as works of critical cultural scholarship, which, by the way, is different from qualitative methods, and think to yourself, wow, qualitative research sure is fucking retarded, but I hope here I have explained through the types of analysis that are used, through the way that the data are collected, and the way that they are assessed, that there are real reasons for which we utilize qualitative research methods. As always, I recommend checking out Joanne Keyton's book, Communication Research, from which I have been discussing all of these topics. Specifically in this case, you should look at chapters 4 and 16. And if you're interested, go ahead and get the whole book, as I will continue to work out of it. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altanovolt.